listeners, and welcome to Season 2 of the Nightmare Trials podcast. I hope you are ready to explore more terrifying content with us. This week, we look into a file we are calling Reflections. When we look into the mirror, what we see is our version of ourselves. But what if our reflection showed us what we really are on the inside? So let's find out. Strap in tight and let the trials begin. Hello, listeners. My name is Professor Adontes Finch, and welcome to the Nightmare Trials.
It's simple. You look into the mirror and you tell me what you see.
I don't get it. I just see myself.
You need to look harder then.
Jilly squinted her eyes and stared deep into the mirror. There wasn't anything there. Well, I guess she was there, just squinting to herself and looking like an idiot. And then there was the older woman who brought her to this mirror. Now when she says older, she doesn't mean like an old codger of a woman. She was maybe 10 or 15 years older than Jilly herself. Her hair was showing signs of graying, and laugh and scowl lines were starting to become prominent on her perfectly aged face. And her eyes were the most amazing things Jilly had ever seen. Like to the point where she felt like she wanted them for herself. One eye was a deep green, while the other was such a light shade of blue that it looked gray. Jilly began to look around her in the mirror, wondering if what she was supposed to see was somewhere else behind her. But all she saw was the apothecary shop with its wooden shelves and ornate bottles of different tinctures and dried herbs. But that was it. It was the shop, Jilly herself, and this woman.
It's just the reflection of me. There isn't anything else to look at. You know what? I think I want my money back. You haven't shown me anything here that... Did you see that?
Jilly turned to the woman who seemed to have not seen anything at all. She just stared back at her, her face devoid of any emotion at all. Jilly turned back to the mirror, and there it was. Something like a delay, but also different. She was able to watch her own reflection turn its head back from the woman and stare right back at her. Confusion swept over Jilly, and a bit of panic began to swell up within her as she stared at her reflection. But whatever she had expected her stare to look like in the mirror, it was not what was being projected back to her. Instead, her reflection's mouth began to open slowly as its head leaned backwards. Its eyes rolled back, and just when Jilly thought the mouth couldn't open any wider, it did. She could almost hear its jaw pop as small tremors ripped through each side of the reflection's face. She watched in horror as the skin at the side of the lips began to rip and separate. Blood began to pool down from each cheek on the reflection's face, moving under her chin and flowing between her breasts. And just when Jilly thought that the thing's mouth would unhinge completely and fall away from its body, it stopped. Her breathing became heavy as seconds ticked by, and she couldn't look away, even though she wanted to, but she was captured by the sight in front of her.
What do you see?
Jilly jumped and almost let out a scream. In all the chaos she saw in front of her, she forgot that the older woman was even in the room with her. Her eyes started to where the woman's reflection should have been, but she wasn't there. Instead of the beautiful woman that was once standing beside her, Jilly saw a pure nightmare. A man now resided behind her, his biceps exposed and nearly as large as her thighs. Veins rippled and protruded from under his pale and sickly skin. Scars that had healed improperly adorned his body. The fleshy pink welts looking out of place in contrast to his deathly skin tone. As she stood there frozen in fear, she began to notice that the man wasn't wearing any clothes at all. The only thing covering any part of his body was a gas mask and old black goggles. Tears began to fall down her face, and her mind screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. As much as she wanted to move, she physically couldn't. She watched as hands reached up and slowly wrapped around the reflection. Jilly's own heart stopped when she realized that she could now feel those hands on her body, moving up and down and grabbing her. She watched as the figure moved in closer to her, and she felt something hard brush up against her back. Then the sound of heavy and raspy breathing came from the man. Sobs now flowed from her, and the man in the reflection tilted his head to the side as if he was asking her what was wrong. Her lips began to quiver, and she could feel the moment was coming when she would let the fear within her take over. And from past experiences, she knew what would come next. The man pushed himself into her back harder now, and his hands began to move down towards her skirt. She felt the fabric lift, exposing her, and she felt the man's other arm begin to grip tightly around her throat. Her underwear began to be removed, and that is when she let the fear really set in. She couldn't believe that this was going to happen, not again. It wasn't her fault that she was an attractive woman. It wasn't her fault that she looked so meek in the eyes of men. And it wasn't her fault that every time someone attempted to sexually assault her, she let the fear take control. And that is what she let happen right this second. In an instant, Jilly let out a primal scream. Her face began to quiver as her real jaw began to unhinge and widen. Her head tilted backwards and her teeth sharpened in the fangs. Her eyes rolled to the back of her head and were replaced by black holes. Her arms snapped backwards and gripped the man by the back of his head. He struggled and fought as she slowly began to pull him head first towards her. Her head now all the way arched back and the man's face merely inches from her fangs. She lunged upwards, taking the man's front half of his face with her. He didn't even have time to scream. The man's body began to go limp in her arms, but she still ate, taking bites from his head. She would admit that the gas mask was tough and very chewy, but it added a flavor that she hadn't experienced before. It was sort of leathery and it paired well with the man's brains. When his head was finally devoured, Jilly began her transformation back. And when she came to, she looked in the mirror to see her own reflection smiling back at her as she sat in a pool of blood. She knew that she was a monster. But given the circumstances, she was the best monster there could be.
What did you see, Jilly?
This time, Jilly did scream from fright. She had forgotten about the woman in the room. In fact, she thought that the man she ate was somehow that woman. Like maybe she was a shapeshifter or something. It wouldn't have been too weird to her. Jilly herself was something otherworldly. So why not this lady?
Jilly, you need to tell me what you see.
Jilly turned from the mirror to see the woman staring at her.
I saw a vile human, and I took him away from hurting anyone ever again in this world.
The older woman smiled at Jilly and extended her hand out to help her up. When standing, Jilly adjusted her clothes and then peeked over at the mirror.
So, what is this thing? Why did it show me what it did?
Does it matter? You saw what you needed to see and nothing more, and because of that, you are changed now. I don't think you will need to use fear to become yourself anymore.
What am I supposed to do with that information now? Am I like some horror superhero?
You do what you want with that knowledge. It isn't up to me.
Jilly just stared back at the woman, contemplating the possibilities of what she now knew she could do. She let out a sigh.
Well, I guess that's it. Thank you. I'm sort of a mess. Do you have any clothing around here that I can have?
What do you see?
Nothing in particular, I guess.
You need to look harder then.
I'm not squinting my eyes and looking into a mirror to see something that isn't there.
Look harder.
Danthon let out an exacerbated sigh. But he did as the woman said. He squinted and browsed around the mirror, looking for anything that stood out to him. But there was nothing there. Just this damn shop reflected back at him. He knew he shouldn't have come into here, but the woman looked so damn sexy. She caught his eye as he was walking by, and he had to stop and just stare at her. Her hair was like fire, and her figure just took his breath away. But more than that, she had noticed him looking at her, and she gave him a soft smile. He wasn't going to pass that up at all. So he went in to chat with her. She seemed nice enough and almost a little interested in him, which was awesome. He hadn't gotten laid in months now, and he could feel that pressure building up within him. He tried to take care of it many times, but there is no substitute for the real thing. So driven by hormones and desire, he thought he would just shoot a shot with the witchy lady at the apothecary shop. But now he was getting annoyed. He expected some flirting, exchanging of numbers, and if he was real lucky, maybe a quickie in the back. It's happened before. He was a very attractive man, so he sort of got what he wanted out of women. It's just sometimes he had to work a little harder every now and then. But now he is standing in front of a mirror, staring at nothing in particular. It was weird to think of the extent that some people will go just to get laid. She had suggested that he take a look in the mirror when he had asked her for his number. You know, so he could keep in touch. Thinking that this was a ploy to get him away from the window so they could have some alone time, he was more than happy to oblige. But again, there was nothing there.
What do you see?
Danthan turned his head towards her and looked at her incredulously.
Man, I don't see shit. It's just me, you, and your little witch shop.
He turned his head back to the mirror and stared at himself.
You know, when you brought me back here, I thought you were wanting something like alone time. Like just me and you to get to know one another better. But here I am, just staring into this mirror and... Oh, what the fuck?
Danthan jumped backwards, nearly falling on his ass. He looked into the top corner of the mirror to see a ghostly face of a woman staring back at him. She appeared to be clinging like a spider in the corner of the room up towards the ceiling. He shot his head around to take a better look, but there was nothing behind him. He looked back towards the mirror and there she was.
Hey, do you see that? There's a woman.
He slowly turned his head from the mirror to talk to the shopkeeper, but she was no longer there. He looked around the room he was in to see if he could spot her, but she just wasn't anywhere to be seen. That is when he heard the tapping. A coldness began to consume his body and fill the room. He could see his breath as it clouded in front of him and dissipated in the air around him. He slowly turned his head towards the mirror as another tapping noise rang out. Standing there now in front of him and looking back through the mirror were dozens of women, all with tortured looks on their face. His eyes grew large as he began to realize that he recognized them.
There ain't no way in hell this is real.
Screams erupted in the room around him, piercing his ears. All of the screams of all of his victims. The last dying noises they made before he took his anger out on them. But he had to do what he had to do to them. He had to do it because if he didn't, he would have gone insane. It's a burden he had to carry that no one else can understand. He had to do it. He had to do it. The tapping on the glass turned to pounding as the women reflecting back at him tried to escape their confines. He watched as the mirror vibrated and shook, but it never cracked or broke. His fear began to subside as a wry smile crept across his face.
Y'all stuck in there, aren't you? Well, fuck you. Should've just given me what I wanted, when I wanted it. But no, you all had to be snotty bitches.
He extended his hand towards the mirror and flipped the women off. He laughed and even felt a sense of elation at the gesture. He felt safe, even satisfied. He even thought that he would take this mirror with him just so he could relive these visions over and over again. So he could hear their screams and revel in the fact that he was a man transcendent from animal. He was an apex predator, and he would keep on doing what he did best for years to come. But first, he thought to himself that he would add one more to his collection. He just had to find that damn shopkeep. He turned from the mirror and started to walk away when he felt a tug at the back of his shirt. He was lifted from his feet and unceremoniously slammed to the ground. The breath escaped his body and floated above him in a cloud. As his eyes slammed shut from the sharp pain he felt on his back, he groaned as a dull ache began to swell up from the back of his head. He must have hit his head on the ground. He slowly opened his eyes to notice that his vision was blurred slightly, almost like he had a minor concussion. As his vision cleared, he began to make out something above him. It was pale and almost sickly looking. By the time he realized what it was too late. He let out a scream. The shopkeep stood in the entryway to the room, watching as the apparition of Danthan's victims began to crawl out of the mirror. She watched as he began to realize what was happening. A twitch of a smile formed on her face as she listened to the man scream as she watched him try to fight his way out of their grasp. But there were dozens of them, and the dead do not feel pain. So every punch he landed was nothing to these women. Remarkably though, Danthan was able to rise to his feet. two of the figures strapping themselves to his back and biting into the flesh of his neck. He went to run, but was swept forward. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading for help. But no help was given. His fingernails dug into the wooden floors and left claw marks as he was slowly dragged into the mirror. Deep grooves formed in the wood floor as he was dragged backward, his nails digging in, chipping, bending, and popping off. Small streaks of blood trailed behind him as he was pulled into the mirror. The room around her fell silent. She stepped towards the mirror and watched as Danthan's face was slammed against the other side. He was now a reflection, and he looked back at her. His eyes wide with fear. Hands gripped every part of his body and dug deep within his skin. Slowly, pieces of him were removed. Bits of skin here, an appendage there, and finally, his face was peeled back like an orange, exposing the muscle and bone underneath. Danthan was no more, at least not in this world. She stared into the mirror, watching as the women began to retreat into the darkness that now filled the room. She watched as bits of skin and blood began to fuse back together and reconstruct this man's body. He would die like this again, and the cycle will continue over and over until time itself ceases to exist.
What do you see, May?
I'm not sure what I see.
Try and look harder. I need you to see what is in there.
It scares me. I don't want to see it.
I know, sweet girl, but it is important to see. Seeing allows for us to know what is hidden. It allows for us to see what is inside of you.
But I don't like what's in there. I don't want to see that.
Look harder, May.
May stared into the mirror. She didn't like doing this, but the lady insisted that she had to. May was a rule follower, and she had been that way for as long as she could remember. Even during her senior year at high school, she opted out of the big school prank, skip day, and even last day of school party. She did all this because she knew that to break the rules meant there could and would be harsh consequences. And she didn't want that anymore. She had enough consequences and guilt in her young adult mind to fill an ocean and drown anyone who stepped foot in there. She knew that what happened really wasn't her fault though, but she could never get past it. It haunted her and lived with her every single second of every day of her life. And she wanted nothing more than to let it go. She tried therapy, group sessions, and even hypnosis. But all of it had failed her. Because every night she still saw his face, the way it was that day. Eyes staring up to the sky, but nothing behind them to process what he was seeing. His soft face no longer held the light it normally did, and his mouth hung ever so slightly open, as if he was going to whisper a secret to her, something that could have changed it all. But that never came. May shut her eyes and winced her face as a flood of memories hit her over and over again. Tears began to flow down as she could feel the air catching in her throat.
May, you have to look.
She opened her eyes, and there he was, in the reflection staring back at her. The way he looked at her before it all happened. His eyes and face full of life. That beautiful smile on his face. He was her little secret, and she was his. Two young kids in love and full of life. There was nothing the two wouldn't have done for one another. She reached out her hand and placed it on the mirror. From the other side, the boy did the same.
I am so sorry. I am so sorry this happened to you.
The boy said nothing. He just stared back at May with love in his eyes. And that look never faded. Even when the gash appeared on his throat and his clothes became nothing more than tattered remains. Deep festering wounds appeared all over his body. May gasped and stepped back from the mirror. The boy no longer had his right arm, and thick drips of blood began to drop from the ragged bicep and exposed bone.
It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't know. I would have been more careful if I had known.
The boy continued to smile back at May. His lips, now turned blue, began to mouth something back to her. She couldn't quite make out what he was saying. She stared at his lips as they moved. He repeated the same thing over and over again until she finally understood. He was saying that he forgave her. May began to sob uncontrollably, and the vision of the boy began to fade away. She cried out as he disappeared within the reflection in front of her. a light began to form above her, a light she never wanted to see, but was an occurrence that she could not stop. She gasped, began to clutch at her clothes. Then she watched as her reflection hunched over, gripping its stomach. It looked like it was in so much pain, and it was rocking the reflection's body. Then its head shot upwards towards May, the eyes turning yellow and its face elongating. Canine-like teeth and thick fur began to sprout from every pore. Her clothes ripped away as her body began to expand, her skin growing tight and shedding from her body. Large, gnarled claws formed on her hands, and black, thick nails extended from her fingertips. The creature before her stood tall, breathing heavy, and staring back at her. There was a reason why May followed the rules. She had to. She had to be on a regular schedule. And while she would have loved to have joined in on the senior prank day and the party, she couldn't. She tried to get the dates changed to later in the week, but her classmates weren't having any of it. They had no idea that it was going to be a full moon that night. And they had no idea that May would be shackled in her basement, clawing at the walls and doing everything she could to escape and feed.
Thank you for listening and supporting this podcast. If you would like access to the interdimensional radio station, you can search for the Nightmare Trials on Patreon. Once there, it is only $2 per month to gain access to our extra short stories and chat discussion with the professor. Your contribution helps us continue to do what we do. Further, you can go to the nightmaretrials.square.site and order merch and suggest to be a part of one of our stories. We would love nothing more than to add your name to our writings. Lastly, make sure to follow the podcast and hit the notification button so you never miss an episode. Until we meet again,